Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Or if I say to you in my own language, g'day, mates. So I hope that you can understand my accent. But firstly, I'd just like to do a big shout out to Frank and the NMMA. You know the leadership that the NMMA shows for our industry nationally here in the States. But what you may not know is the extraordinary leadership that the NMMA shows on the global stage. We are a global community of boaters, of the boating industry. What happens in other parts of the world affects what's happened here. What happens here affects other parts of the world. So it's so important that we come together as a community to be able to set the policy frameworks and advocate and support this magnificent lifestyle. So I'll start with a simple premise, and you've heard this premise today as a theme right through all the presentations that have been made to date. Boating enriches people's lives. What we do, what you do, actually really matters. Just being in, on, or around water has profound effects on human beings. In fact, getting out onto the water, experiencing the wonderful lifestyle that we've got and the sense of time dilation, peace, and well-being that comes from this lifestyle is truly the panacea to modern life. So boating matters. And as a consequence, we have a shared responsibility to take all steps that are required to make sure that this lifestyle prospers, grows, and survives. Our mission singly is to grow participation in recreational boating and to retain existing participation in recreational boating because it matters for our community, both in this country and around the world. But it has its challenges. And as Frank said, there's a whole range of work that needs to be done across the advocacy space because too often misinformation, inadequate information, or ideology or anecdote are the foundations of policy that start to guide regulation and restriction. We have to take the efforts to make sure that's not the case. And a great example of this is the approach to decarbonisation. So decarbonisation and policies around decarbonisation represent probably one of the greatest regulatory threats that our industry will face over the coming years and decades. But at the same time, there is a consumer expectation that is being driven by policy platforms that are put forward in terms of what expectations are in relation to what our industry should be doing to actually address this. And where that comes from is that in 2016, 196 countries, yours and mine, many others, all came together and signed the Paris Agreement with a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases by 43% by 2030. Now we're in 2024. From a regulatory framework point of view, 2030 is like next week. And so as a consequence, the reality right now, as you can imagine, is that we're actually not on track to achieve this. What does that mean? It means that regulators will start to think about what policies they need to put in place to make us do it, to make us achieve these objectives. And in the absence of good information, decisions are made on anecdote, on ideology, and on poor information. So at ICOMIA, what we focused our attention on was to say, how do we do an undertaking, an exercise that ensures that we have the best information available so that we can provide the hard data to enable policymakers to make good, informed decisions. To do that, we engaged Ricardo. Ricardo are an international consultant, 20 countries, 3,000 employees, but more importantly, they are recognised as the specialist in this particular space, so that governments around the world will take the information that they provide and the conclusions that they draw as solid foundations to actually undertake policy making. So this study, the scope of this study include 9 different craft types and 5 different propulsion systems. Those craft types range from small inflatable tenders through a range of small boats, fishing boats, runabouts, through sailing yachts, through displacement motorboats, high performance motor yachts, and even a PWC used in a commercial environment. Now this particular study is for craft below 24 metres. It's not super yachts, it's not ships, it's purely recreational boating. And the craft that we chose are the most representative set of what is being sold into the market today, but they are also a really good representative set of the existing fleet. So that gives us the framework of making sure that we've got the right craft set. The 5 propulsion types, the benchmark, fossil fuel, diesel and gasoline, compared to sustainable drop-in fuels, compared to full battery electric, compared to hybrids, compared to hydrogen, and hydrogen used in 2 ways, internal combustion engines and in fuel cells. And we did this study using full life cycle assessment. Now that means cradle to grave. Where do the materials come from? How are they transported around the world? How is the manufacturing process done? How is the operational phase? What is the maintenance that happens during the operating phase? And at the end of the day, what is the end of life? We have assessed the carbon in every stage of the life of these vessels. 9 craft types, 5 propulsion systems, 45 full comprehensive life cycle assessments that actually come down to giving us the data. Now, before I go to the results, the important thing is there's some assumptions that need to be built into these reports. And they're based on both actual data of how boats are used, but also the physical engineering of how you can actually compare them. So if we look at engine hours, and this is probably one of the most surprising things that people outside our industry don't understand. The vast majority of recreational craft have annual engine hours less than 50 hours. And I think the reason that that's important to understand is that the actual period over which these engines are being used, the amount of carbon that's actually coming out of the operating phase compared to the manufacturing phase and the embodied carbon in the craft is very small. Boats have more in common than aircraft than they do with cars. It also takes 10 times the energy to move a boat through the water than it does a car across land. So when we look at that framework, and then we look at the technologies that are available for comparison, and just to use an example, if we look at the energy density of how energy is stored on a boat. So if we look at liquid fuels, whether they're fossil fuels or sustainable fuels, they typically will have more than 30 times the energy density of a lithium-ion battery, for example. But electric motors are much more efficient, probably about 3 times more efficient, in transferring that stored energy in a battery into forward motion on a boat. But it still means to get the same range and performance, you need more than 10 times the volume of fuel that you would ordinarily store on a boat if you were to place it with batteries, which clearly, from a functional, weight, cost, all those bases, is not practical. So within this report, what we've had to do is to engineer appropriate scaling of those energy storage devices. And what that really means is that the comparisons that are done mean that the range and performance of something like battery or hydrogen is only 10 to 20% of its liquid fuel comparison counterpart. And the reason that that's important, it still provides a solution. It's a practical solution. We're comparing proper alternatives, but it's important to note that it's not apples for apples. So when we look at it, the other thing that's important, and I think that this is something that we should take pause on and actually understand, we build extremely durable products. When you look at the life of the products that we build, from the smallest craft to the largest craft, we're talking about 30, 40, 50 years. Durability is a fundamental component of sustainability. And we should be very proud of the quality and the durability of the products that we build. But as a consequence, it does have some challenges for emerging technologies. Because battery technology, as an example, doesn't have a life commensurate with the life of the boat, so you'd have to allow for, within these models, replacement of those during the life of the boat. So it's important to understand that when you create any model or any assessment to undertake these types of studies, that you actually need to actually bring that level of information and understand the parameters on which the assessment is actually done. So, importantly, the conclusions. Well, the single overarching conclusion, of course, is that our industry is so diverse that there is no one size fits all. However, if our objective is to actually meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement, and that we look today based on current technologies and what those projected technologies are going forward, if we look at it to basically say what is the outcomes for how our industry actually takes this information forward, then the reality is that the overarching conclusion is that the best pathway today is the implementation of sustainable fuels. And what's really interesting about that is that there were some surprises in that data. And the surprises were, for instance, a cruising yacht. Cruising yacht, based on the data, and this is data that the US EPA acknowledges, is only about 28 hours per year, obviously, because the sails are up as much as often. But the reality is, in that particular circumstance, there just isn't enough operating hours of engines to actually offset the carbon through the manufacturing process. So the fundamental question is why? Why is that the case? And what we found was that there is such an extraordinary amount of carbon actually in the manufacturing process. The sourcing of the materials, the globalization of transporting these materials around the world, the manufacturing process itself. If you compare it to a car, in the boating industry, more than 50% of the carbon of the life of a boat is actually in the pre-operating phase. A car, it's more like 10 or 15%. And so we come to this scenario where we can see that right now, having a pathway to a supply chain for sustainable fuels, particularly sustainable drop-in fuels, provides us the opportunity to demonstrate that our industry has the ability to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement. And more importantly, this study was focused on new craft, but that same outcome solves the problem for the existing fleet. In your country, there's 12.5 million motorised craft. You sell about 250,000 of those a year. So you'll only renew 20% of the fleet in a decade. So to actually take the whole industry towards carbon reduction, we need solutions that actually deal with the existing fleet as well, and that's where sustainable fuels come in. But let me be really clear. One of the key things about sustainable fuels is it provides the breathing space we need to address some of the shortcomings of the current emerging technologies. And those shortcomings are fundamentally about the energy density of the ability to store on the craft. And so we need to have focus and innovation around those spaces, because it comes down to efficiency, it comes down to potentially hull design and foiling and a whole range of other opportunities that exist to be able to improve the way that we use stored energy to achieve forward motion on vessels. So there are, positive signs that come from this information. The first thing is this is the most comprehensive study that ICOMIA has ever undertaken. It provides hard data, 558-page of exciting engineering reading, believe me, it's very good on long-haul flights. So the reality of that, though, is that it provides a great opportunity for us to be able to set the stage and have the conversations that are required to take our industry forward. So the important takeouts from this. Sure, sustainable fuels are recognised as a key pathway for us to go forward for both new and the existing fleet. But as I said before, it provides the breathing space for us to work together with emerging technologies to work out how to actually provide those adaptations. There are changing use models, shared ownerships, charter, clubs, where all of a sudden the constraints around, potentially around reduced range or charging and those sorts of things operate in a more controlled environment. They represent classic use cases where we may be able to embrace these technologies, test them and engage scaling. I've seen so many presentations at this show so far where there's some fantastic innovations around the utilisation of hydrogen, around electric, around foiling, around all of these other technologies. And I think this is the key thing. This study isn't about stifling innovation. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's providing hard data to ensure that policymakers are given the real information that they need to make informed decisions about how to set policy standards for our industry, because we show and proactively take leadership to actually put that information in front of them. And our objective is to basically say, we've got this. We've got this. We know what to do to take it forward. So the key element is, I circle back to the start. What we've seen today is that boating genuinely enriches people's lives. We have an opportunity to use the information, to use our skills, to enable us to actually set a strategy for a sustainable future for our industry. We all want a sustainable future for our industry. But importantly, you are the leaders of our industry. In this room, you make the biggest impact on our industry worldwide, all of you. So it sits with you, with your responsibility to embrace these opportunities, take this information forward, and help us prosecute this as a clear case for how our industry will meet the objectives of being able to decarbonise over coming years. So I wish you a fantastic show. I hope that there's amazing results from this show, and I really appreciate your attention to this morning. Thank you.